Everyone's attention, please.
Yes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the IIAS conference room. My name is Joaquin Lapuz, and I'm the web content coordinator at the Humanities Across Borders educational program here at the International Institute for Asian Studies. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Case Closed, Physician-Patient Encounters in the American Colonial Philippines, and introduce today's speaker, Bianca Angelien Claveria. Bianca is a PhD candidate at the Institute for History here at Leiden University, and she's part of an ERC-funded research project called COMET, Human Subject Research and Medical Ethics in Colonial Southeast Asia, led by her supervisor, Dr. Fenka Sissing. Her PhD research project broadly covers the history of tuberculosis and leprosy in American Colonial Philippines, with a particular focus on biomedical experiments, physician-patient encounters, and medical ethics. So the first part of today's session will be dedicated to Bianca's lecture, and then the second part will be an open Q&A where we will address many questions possible. You're more than welcome to raise your hand, ask questions here, or for our online audience, please feel free to type in the chat box any questions you have for Bianca. So please note that this lecture is recorded, but only Bianca and the screen will be visible. So let's give a warm round of applause. Bianca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Joaquin, for the introduction. To our on-site attendees and to those joining us via Zoom, a pleasant Thursday to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and a special thank you to Joaquin and Anne-Marie of IIAS, who have generously given me this opportunity to give a lecture. Now, in Case Closed, Physician-Patient Encounters in American Colonial Philippines, I will be presenting an overview and some case studies from my ongoing PhD research here in Leiden. Now, I am aware that this is a lecture and not a seminar, so class participation is not really expected, but I hope that you wouldn't mind if once in a while I will attempt to solicit some feedback from all of you. Do not worry, the questions won't be difficult, and the quality of your answers will not in any way affect your final grade. So next slide. Now, whenever I talk about my research project, I personally like using visual art, like paintings, to get the metaphorical ball rolling. On this screen are details from Filipino national artist Carlos Botong Francisco's painting series entitled The Progress of Medicine in the Philippines. These particular details do well in giving you a bird's eye view of milestones in the country's long medical history. On these paintings, we see references to compulsory vaccination campaigns during the American colonial period, colonial policies on hygiene and sanitation, the establishment of scientific laboratories and medical institutions, and other improvements that were crucial in the development of modern medicine in the country. Now, narrowing our focus on the painting on the right, the attempt to foreground the key roles played by physicians, nurses, and medical experts in the progress of medicine in the country cannot be ignored. Next slide. Now, the unwavering respect of Filipinos that they have generally for medical men and women of white robes arguably continues to the present. Now, on the right is Dahe Pimpino's Frontliners, which he painted at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Juxtaposing Pimpino's painting is a detail from another work by Francisco entitled Filipino Struggles Through History. Two depictions of what it means to be a hero in the Philippines emerges before our eyes. On the left, we see the revolutionary hero named Andres Bonifacio, leading the charge against the Spaniards in 1896. His right hand clutching a large knife, and his left hand holding a revolver. On the right, we see the heroes of the pandemic, an unnamed masked physician leading the charge, his right hand clutching a bar of soap, and his left hand holding a disinfectant spray. Heroes of different periods fighting different enemies. The former fought against a colonial power, the latter fought against a contagious pathogen. Next slide. But to be Filipino means to also see realities through humor. We love jokes. On the screen are two comic strips showing funny encounters between a Filipino physician and his patient. On the first comic strip, we see the patient being told that he has limited time to live. 5 years? 5 months? Nope. The physician stoically responds with a countdown of 5 seconds while he washed his patient's sweat buckets. On the second comic strip, we see the physician instructing his patient to drink a glass of water with a piece of paper in it. The patient obliges and asks what is wrong with him. The physician responds that he's gullible. Next slide. Filipinos have a high regard for anyone in the medical field, and considering the volumes of knowledge whizzing through their brains and years of experience under their belts, whatever the physician says or orders are gospel truths. So highly regarded are physicians that a popular Filipino song in the 1970s even entertained the possibility that the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan, who led the Spanish expedition to what would become the Philippines, cried out for a doctor after his defeat at the Battle of Mactan in 1521. Joking aside, as a historian, I am obliged to remind you all that, of course, this is absolutely incorrect, as many of the other questionable stanzas of this song. But this song is quite personal for me, as I can still vividly remember Professor Ambeto Campo, who visited IIAS earlier this year, jokingly used this song in his classes, I believe back in the Philippines. And I also recall my maternal grandmother singing these verses to me when I was young. Heroes, humorists, healers, and so much more. Physicians could be empty canvases waiting to be painted on, or they could be characters in a historically inaccurate karaoke song. Next slide. But in some stories and biographies by Filipino physicians, it is notable how their metaphorical depictions of themselves or their colleagues in the medical field took on different forms. They were the gods, the demons, or the mere mortals who roamed the hallowed halls of the Philippine General Hospital, or PGH, which was Manila's primary public hospital, established in 1907, and actually still exists up to today. The architecture of the hospital's main building is worth marveling at, but I must point out that it was not built next to a river. What you see on the screen is a photo of the newly built hospital, but it was inundated by floodwater. Flooding in Manila has already been a problem way back in 1910, as it continues to be in the present, unfortunately. Next slide. But unlike the flood projects back in the Philippines that are haunted by ghost contractors, cheers to those who caught my political joke right there, Dr. Arturo B. Rotor's short story, The Men Who Play God, The Men Who Play God, the PGH was depicted as a temple lorded over by its gods in white robes. They held their patients' strings of fate, selected who gets to be treated or shunned away, or in this excerpt on the screen, they decided which patient will be blessed with a freshly harvested cornea. There were 165 possible candidates, which were whittled down to 3. Their senior physician asked the staff, "Which one of you would like to play God today?" As they had to make a decision from a pile of clinical charts. Only one patient could prevail. Next slide. In Dr. Ting Tiongco's anecdote, God Forgives, he shared how he was haunted by the consequences of a personal feud with a colleague over the limited supply of blood available in the PGH. Tiongco believed that as much as possible, preference should be given to patients in the charity ward. When his colleague's sister, who was in the paid yard, needed blood, Tiongco, out of spite and overpowered by the demon in him, chose not to heed the request, which unfortunately led to the patient's death. Tiongco had the power to decide who gets the blood, but only God had the power to forgive. I am human, Tiongco admits. Next slide. The PGH may have had its fair share of gods and demons throughout its history. But at the end of every day, the hospital was a place where patients were heard and where physicians healed. In Dr. Ronnie Baticolon's personal essay, The PGH was a place where physicians cultivated their relationships with their patients. For Baticolon, the hospital was also neither the temple of power nor the depths of hell. It was where mortal physicians humbly realized that on some days you could not save them all. Next slide. The PGH is just one of the many spaces where we could interrogate physician-patient encounters. But if we want to engage with them in all of their complexities and cacophonies, responses and resistances, I'd like to argue that we should be justified to question the supposed silent world of the physician and the patient. In his book, The Silent World of Doctor and Patient, J. Katz observed how patients have been depicted in history as incapable of making the correct decisions when it comes to their treatments. The burden of making the best decision for the patient was often placed on the shoulders of physicians. Katz saw the relevance of questioning these depictions of a physician's silent care and a patient's passive compliance. To better appreciate these encounters, the paternalistic relationship often attributed to it must be questioned, and that the patient must be seen as someone capable of showing agency and making their own decisions. Physician-patient encounters were anything but one-way relationships, and that the world they were in was anything but silent. My own research takes inspiration from this critique, and in the theoretical approaches such as those by Roy Porter, Florian Condreau, and Arthur Kleinman, to name a few, which in their own respective ways appreciated the active roles of patients, the importance of their own cultural experiences, diseases, and how both physicianhood and patienthood were dynamic identities that could change over time. Beyond being submissive, passive, or controlling experiences, I attempt to show how medical encounters in American Colonial Philippines were actually opportunities for the recognition of their respective autonomies. Moreover, it ventures to reconceive medical institutions where human experimentation occurred and thrived as spaces where both the physician and the patient arbitrated how those experiments were to be done humanely. Now, to further define and concretize my research scope, I used the case studies of the mycobacterium diseases of tuberculosis and leprosy. Though both are considered as diseases of antiquity, this research appreciated their shared etiological complexities, the resiliences of their respective bacilli, similarities in their methods of prevention and treatment, possibilities even of cross-immunity between them, the historical collaborations between the respective experts, and their continued relevance even until the present day. Throughout this lecture, I will be presenting case studies which depicted varied forms of physician-patient encounters involving tuberculosis and leprous cases, and the different kinds of sources that I used for my research project. Very much like detective work, the game is afoot, as we decipher these sources for telling clues and attempt to offer possible deductions. At the end of this lecture, will we be able to say case closed? Well, let's see. Next slide. Okay. Manuel L. Quezon served as the president of the Philippine Commonwealth from 1935 until his death in 1944, as he succumbed to a long battle against tuberculosis. Recently, and to our viewers back in the Philippines, you would know this, his name and legacies reignited some traction back in the Philippines because of a newly released and apparently highly debated biographical movie also named after him. Eradicating tuberculosis in the Philippines was one of Quezon's primary advocacies during his presidency, and a tuberculosis sanatorium in Manila was actually renamed after him. It is now known as the Quezon Institute. Next slide. On this slide are pages from Quezon's clinical record, written by his physicians and nurses during his final months in 1944. As a historical source, this record is special as it provides glimpses to the kinds of tuberculosis treatments that were available during that time, and how Quezon's physicians and nurses documented the politician's health. But after closer study, one also encounters Quezon's presence as a patient. We learn more about how Quezon actually spent most of his days, apparently in long intervals of sleep. More importantly, we see Quezon also dictating what information should be logged in his clinical record. He apparently wanted to know the changes in his temperature. Next slide. So this slide shows the doctor's orders or instructions for whoever was taking care of the president. It outlined his medications, the respective dosages, and other daily routines. Apparently, the president took sponge baths twice a week. And when it came to his food, he could have, and I quote, have anything as desired. Next slide. Now, during my fieldwork in the former leper colony in Culion, that's an island in the Philippines, I engaged with written sources and material objects, such as this piece of furniture you can see on the slide. Standing next to the furniture was our local tour guide and proud descendant of a Culion patient, Pastor Hermie Villanueva. Without Pastor Hermie's explanation about how this particular furniture was used by the lepers in Culion, I admit I would have almost ignored it. Before I give the answer, and perhaps anyone would like to take a stab at how this furniture was used. Anyone? Like wild guesses. How do you think this was used? So I placed Pastor Hermie there so you could have like a reference for scale. So it's not really that big.
For kneeling on?
So it's a table
Sitting
and
on?
then there's something on it.
There's something on top.
Which is attached.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe, and just one guess? Anyone from our online attendees want to take a stab at it? My family knows this, so you can't answer. Okay, in the Philippines, we have this phrase called siret. It's like a, what do you call it? It's like a variation of the English phrase, let's hear it. And when you're out of guesses. So I'm gonna tell you the correct answer. Please, next slide. It was actually used by the children in the colony who were too short for the physicians to properly examine. If not on this examining chair, the children would stand on regular chairs, as you could see on the photo. You could actually move the top of the examining chair like a turntable to get a proper 360-degree look at the child's body. I personally find this object very interesting because, like Quezon's clinical record, we could reimagine the active presence of the patient through this object, albeit controlled by the observing physician. They were objects created for and made relevant by physician-patient encounters. Next slide. But admittedly, the bulk of my research project relies on written or published sources, the traditional bread and butter of historians. Now, to understand the complex and intricate decision-making process behind the diagnosis of tuberculosis and leprosy, I refer to patient case files and transcripts from clinical pathological conferences. To test their feasibility as sources, I conducted a preliminary case study using clinical records and conference transcripts published in the Bulletin of the San Juan de Dios Hospital de Manila Journal from 1930 to 1939. Now, I looked into each patient's family history, personal history, differential and clinical diagnosis, laboratory findings, if any, and the results of the autopsy for any references to tuberculosis, its symptoms, and its bacilli. I was able to identify 30 tuberculosis-related cases, and an analysis of these patient histories pointed toward the following initial observations. First, regardless of chief complaints, it was deemed important that patients disclose the existence of tuberculosis cases in their family. Second, the admission or denial of tuberculosis cases in one's family did not wholly influence the physician's decision to subject the patient to further testing or examination to confirm or test their diagnosis. And lastly, it was not unusual that tuberculosis cases were only identified after autopsy. Now, on this slide are two examples of notable patient case histories. Case number 6 and the case of Fausto Valencia. Case number 6 denied any history of tuberculosis in his family, and his laboratory findings were negative of the tuberculosis bacilli. But in the diagnosis, we see, though lung cancer was considered as the primary disease, his attending physician did not dismiss the possible presence of tuberculosis. It must be noted that case number 6 complained of breathlessness, lumbar pains, and confessed to be a heavy smoker. The autopsy did reveal the malignant tumor, but also, lo and behold, the suspected tuberculosis. Fausto Valencia, on the other hand, was another curious case. Valencia admitted that his father died of tuberculosis and complained of prolonged coughs. It was not stated if he underwent any laboratory testing, but the diagnosis was myocardial insufficiency. Simply stated, his heart was not pumping enough blood. Though his autopsy did reveal the problems in his heart, it also revealed the unnoticed problems in his lungs, which was marked with the tuberculous bacilli. Now, before I move on to the next slide, let me offer questions, which perhaps we can explore further later during the discussion or Q&A. Case number 6, Fausto Valencia. Both were tuberculous cases, but were identified differently. One was given a number, the other had his full name disclosed. Why the difference? Also, I must add that these sources were published, meaning anyone could read them, and that these clinical pathological conferences were open to any member of the hospital staff to join and listen in. For clinical conferences, meaning the patient was still alive, at least for the San Juan de Dios Hospital, it was only in 1937 when they explicitly recommended the patient involved should be present at the conference where his or her case was being discussed. Perhaps to our attendees who are in the medical field, what are your thoughts on this? Next slide. Now, compared to other diseases experienced during the American period, tuberculosis was an elusive disease that was difficult to diagnose. Even though diagnostic methods such as X-ray, fluoroscopic examinations, tuberculin tests, and sputum tests were already available, they were not infallible and were still prone to mistakes in the reading of laboratory findings. In 1930, the PGH reported that 44% of their errors in clinical diagnosis were caused by their physician's obsession with tuberculosis, and this was actually the highest percent of errors in their tabulations. But the elusiveness of tuberculosis and the obsession physicians had for the disease were not left in the past. In one of his essays, Dr. Baticolon shared how his fixation with tuberculosis without considering other possible diseases led to the wrong diagnosis of his patient, Marites. Only after testing did they find out that Marites apparently had lung cancer. No wonder the tuberculosis treatments were not working. Baticolon realized that differential diagnoses were not just forms of intellectual masturbations to flaunt their critical thinking and profound medical knowledge. They were humbling opportunities to encounter their patients as individuals with different complaints and varying experiences. Borrowing the words of Baticolon, these patients were more than just textbook cases. Next slide. Now, some practical reasons why providing differential diagnosis was and still is perceived as a crucial skill for physicians was that it tested the competencies of medical students and interns, and it allowed attending physicians to systematically confront doubts surrounding their patients' ailments. The image of a doubting Thomas might sound poetic in a biblical context, right? But a doubting doctor doesn't sound so reassuring in a hospital context. You would prefer your doctor to be collected, confident, cool. But in studying the nuance as a physician-patient encounters, I've learned to appreciate the importance of doubt when it came to experimental medical treatments involving human test subjects. By the late 1920s, tuberculosis and leprosy experts in the Philippines realized that the leprosy bacilli was difficult to cultivate artificially or through lower animals, which considerably limited their options for test subjects. Now, in contrast, the tuberculosis bacilli could be easily cultivated in the laboratory and inoculated to infect animals. In my preliminary survey of medical literature during the American colonial period, medical literature, particularly those seeking to find viable treatments against tuberculosis. Very often, the proponents resorted to laboratory protocols or animal testing. Rarely did they involve human test subjects unless they were patients already seeking treatment in the sanitarium, or in the case in the slide, tuberculous patients who were deemed what they call hopeless and beyond aid. It's interesting to encounter these kinds of human subject experiments at a time when a code of ethics specifically for human experimentation was virtually non-existent. American physicians during this period mainly grounded their decisions on the judgment of their colleagues or the judgment of relevant US Supreme Court decisions, which is why this 1930s experiment on tuberculous patients by Dr. Gallardo really caught my attention, given how he recognized uncertainties and possible repercussions of his quote-unquote radical treatment, and how he sought the judgment of his colleagues to confirm his diagnosis of advanced cases. Now, I want to focus with particularly case number 1. Gallardo's encounters with case number 1 were arguably thought-provoking, and deserve further analysis. Case number 1 seemed to struggle with the disease more and with its treatment compared with cases numbers 2 and 3. Case number 1 was greatly burdened by poverty and had a large family to provide for, which were reasons that prompted, apparently, Gallardo to discontinue the treatment for over a year. This is quite curious, as one could ask, did the treatments require money? Or did Gallardo realize the treatment was just too much of a burden? It also appears that after seeing the patient's worsened condition, Gallardo considered subjecting the patient to the treatment again, even if it meant more prodding or persuasion on his end. Was it mainly because case number 1's worsened condition was a perfect fit for the protocol? Or did Gallardo just really have that much faith in the success of his treatment that he felt obligated to provide a possible cure? Case number 1 apparently had to be pressured to accept the treatment. Now, we all have to wonder, what were the concerns that caused his resistances? Now, this is where we do hit the wall sometimes. The intent or motivations of both patients and physicians in the past are challenging, if not impossible, to ascertain. To even dare judge them through the lens of the present is an even more problematic and skewed approach among historians. But even without an exact answer to these questions, asked earlier, the practice of asking them nonetheless encourages us to further critique or even doubt the information that our sources offer us. Next slide. Gallardo's experimental treatments were reported in a newspaper article, and the initial success of his treatments caught the attention of his colleagues and even the director of the Bureau of Health. In one of his letters, Gallardo shared how he was approached, apparently by a young private physician who was eager to learn how to administer the experimental treatment, and how he seemed ready to conduct the treatment on his own. But when faced with the live, breathing patient, this young doctor wavered and doubted himself, opting Gallardo to take on the reins. Gallardo believed that physicians, especially those in private practice, and who could not benefit from the endorsements or support offered by public medical institutions, should steel themselves more with confidence if they want to fight tuberculosis. An image of a doubting doctor face to face with tuberculosis, the captain of death. This doesn't seem like an image of a physician that we're used to, right? We're accustomed with stories of David's conquering the Goliaths. Whatever happened to the gods, the demons, or the heroes in white robes? But I would like to propose that another valuable takeaway from studying physician-patient encounters is that as much as there are no straightforward patients, as Baticolon observed, there were also no straightforward physicians. Next slide. Now, let us now move on to case studies involving leprous patients. There were leper wards in Manila hospitals and skin dispensaries or clinics that dotted the country during the early 20th century. But for this lecture, I will limit my discussion on physician-patient encounters experienced specifically in Culion, which was hailed in the past as the world's largest leper colony. How were experimental treatments for leprosy conducted in Culion? Was it the same as Galgardo's protocols, where it was only reserved for those in dire or advanced stages? Could leprous patients decide on what treatments or medications will be given to them? In the minutes of the meeting of the Culion Medical Board, particularly from 1924 to 1925, Culion physicians strategized on how to address the persisting habits of their patients in buying anti-leprosy drugs from pharmacies in Manila, and apparently in secretly injecting themselves with those drugs or paying someone else to do it for them. The drugs were identified as what they called anti-leprina and ketonina. After much investigation, they also found out that the patients received permission from their own private physicians and that they were willing to buy those drugs even without proper labeling or seals. Now, this troubled the Director of Health, who called for the board to stop these practices and to control the flow of those drugs into Culion. But interestingly, two Culion Medical Board members, Dr. Wade and Dr. Avellana, expressed their willingness to accommodate the requests of their patients. Because for them, if the drugs worked and showed promising results, and if the patients desired it, then the use of those drugs should not be wholly prohibited. Both recognized that compulsion was not the only method in providing healing for their patients. Quoting Dr. Avellana, they really should not be treated like slaves. Their patients could choose for themselves. And borrowing the words of Dr. Wade, they probably have the right to do so. Next slide. Undeterred, the board's chairman insisted that the patients be compelled to surrender their privately acquired drugs and that they be treated only in designated public clinics. The patients resisted against these requirements, and one of the reasons was their desire for privacy. And I quote, "Some do not wish to expose their bodies among so many people as are usually present at the clinics," end quote. On the slide is a photo from one of those clinics. And as you can see, clearly the treatment was done in public. And this would, I would like to argue, challenges the image of privacy and confidence that we often associate with physician-patient encounters. Next slide. Later on, the Culion Medical Board revised their policies to effectively regulate the anti-leprosy treatments of their patients, while also acknowledging their own personal choices and decisions. As long as the attending physician has made the effort to confer with or persuade the patient, they would not be faulted if the patient eventually decides to seek private treatment. The board mainly required that patients sign sworn statements that would release the government from any liability, and that the involved private physicians must undergo proper examination or screening. Next slide. These shifts in physician-patient encounters in Culion and changes in how patients were treated can also be seen when comparing earlier provisions from the Bureau of Health in 1911 and the revised counterparts by the late 1920s. As you can see here, in the 1911 manual, it is apparent that the Director of Health called the shots. But in the 1920s revised regulations, at the forefront was the patient. Instead of a timid leprosy sufferer, we encounter rare glimpses of a leper who could resist, who could speak, and who could say no. Next slide. Okay, to show you an example, this was the template that they offered for patients who wanted to seek treatment from private physicians, and all the expectations that follow. If you're wondering what about a minor patient, yes, they will be allowed as long as they have the consent of their guardian. Next slide. And this one would be the sworn statement that private physicians would have to accomplish and submit. And when I was preparing this PowerPoint, I was already preparing for possible questions, and I expect maybe you guys are wondering, okay, for physicians, what about American or foreign physicians? Were they allowed to actually provide treatment? My answer there is yes and no. Yes, in a sense that, sure, if they have collaborations with the Culion experts, they could be personally invited to conduct the research there. But I have encountered letters sent by American physicians and American nurses seeking employment in Culion, only to be deterred and shunned away, which was not a response I was expecting. Apparently, it was done so because they felt that sure, they are experts, but they cannot speak the dialect. They cannot speak the language, which I feel is a very important note to consider. Because for them, you need to be able to interact with the patient. And I even found like they received so many letters seeking employment from Americans. They even wrote like a template letter of rejection so that they could easily just send them away. Next slide. The Culion Medical Board was also receptive to discussions with their patients' elected representatives when it came to medical treatments and their efficacy. Here, in these excerpts from the board's minutes of the meeting, it narrated how one Dr. Castañeda was interviewed by leaders of the leper colony. So you can see them here. And basically, they wanted to seek clarification regarding an anti-leprosy drug. Moreover, instead of just brushing off the matter as inconsequential, these complaints and queries from the patients were regarded with serious consideration. Next slide. Now, to conclude my lecture and to perhaps offer some food for thought, particularly on how we choose to depict and write the histories of physicians and patients, I want to talk about this photo, which, if you were focusing or paying attention, I already showed this photo earlier, and give a brief narration of the incredible but arguably unknown story of patient Joey G. I first encountered this photo when I was reading an article about the Carville Leprosarium in Louisiana, USA. I did not know who Joey G was, I'll just be honest. And I was more interested with the fact that she was being treated with what they called promin, which was apparently used to also treat tuberculosis. Next slide. And then, during one random afternoon in the office, I came across this article about a Filipino leper spy during the Second World War. Her name was Josefina Joey Guerrero. She was the same Joey G in the previous photo. She overcame tuberculosis as a child, but in 1939, as a young woman with her own family, she was diagnosed with leprosy. Fearing stigma and the possibilities of separation from her loved ones, they chose to keep Josefina's leprosy a secret. Next slide. Now, in 1941, the Japanese attacked American air bases in the Philippines and began invading various towns and cities in the country. Josefina, who was given the nickname Joey by the Americans, I don't know why. Maybe Josefina was a different name, difficult name to pronounce, but she was called Joey, played her part in the resistance against the Japanese. She bravely conducted espionage work and provided valuable information on the Japanese troops and their movements to the Filipino guerrillas and the American officers. And it's interesting, right? The visible marks of her disease that made her visibly sick made her invisible as she bravely crossed enemy lines. Quoting Ben Montgomery, who wrote about Joey's trials and triumphs, she bravely walked through the roar of war like an angel of mercy, unafraid, bullets biting the ground at her feet. American soldiers huddled behind walls or crouched in foxholes, marveled as she walked upright while bombs burst around her. Because back then, for context, the Japanese were very worried with any symptoms of leprosy. And upon seeing the leper marks across her body, instead of keeping her in the checkpoints, they would just let her go. Next slide. But the road to healing took decades. While residing in the US, Joey began recreating a new life for herself. She continued her studies, divorced her husband in the Philippines, was remarried to a fellow Carville patient, and eventually gained American citizenship. Her prolonged stay in the US caused tensions with her daughter, Cynthia, who was left behind in the Philippines. Next slide. Cynthia would later admit that she felt she had already lost her mother when she was brought to the Tala Leprosarium in Manila decades ago. Joey chose to live the rest of her life in the US, shrouded in privacy and away from the limelight. When she died in 1996, her obituary merely stated that she was born in Manila and nothing else was said about her heroic deeds. Could we just go back to the other slide? There. I think I completely skipped this one. Now, you see, after the war, Joey was exiled to the Tala Leprosarium in Manila, where she experienced firsthand the dire straits that Filipino leprous patients had to go through. You see, Joey was instrumental in initiating needed changes in the leprosarium, soliciting help from the Americans, and in uplifting the welfare of her Filipino patients. Now, friends and supporters of Joey, who knew about her heroic acts during the war, lobbied to bring her to the US so she could seek treatment in Carville Leprosarium. Now, if you are aware, at that time, there were policies against allowing aliens entering the US. She was able to seek special permission to travel and seek treatment in the country. Around the same time, she was also awarded the Medal of Freedom with Silver Palm. Furthermore, the fanfare and public attention that was surrounding Joey encouraged discussion on how to destigmatize the disease. Slide. So, the quiet end of Joey's story seems anticlimactic. No one knew what she did, and she really kept everything silent. And it's actually not something one would expect from a former leper spy and war hero. There were no fireworks, grand memorials, or parades that flooded the streets. However, it was Joey's own life to live. And if it was lived in silence and in separation from the country she fought for, I personally feel that it does not in any way make her any less heroic. Joey spent her life as a patient who sought to heal herself from the pathogenic enemy, and she was also a patriot who fought for the liberty of her country. In a way, as a patient, Joey had the privilege of actively choosing how she wanted to tell her story. In later interviews, she admitted that she didn't really want to talk about her life in the Philippines anymore. I have almost forgotten them, Joey confessed. This privilege was more often not something other Filipino leprous patients or even tuberculous patients had. If we have depicted physicians as almighty gods, as vengeful demons, and as doubting doctors, Joey's story invites us to contemplate on the kaleidoscope of identities that we could extend to patients. How do we do that? Should we even do that? I have no definite answer to give at the moment, but I would like to hope that at least these steps moving forward to recognize the varied stories of humanity in a country's medical history are valuable steps moving forward. As we have finally reached the end of the lecture, could we confidently say, case closed? Perhaps not just yet, and maybe that's a good thing. Thank you again very much, and I...
So, and then perhaps I think with that, we can begin to wrap up here. Thank you very much, Bianca,
It's a
for your
pleasure.
lovely lecture. Let's give Bianca a little bit of a and thank you all, online and in person, for coming today to this hybrid lecture. So, for any other upcoming events about Asia in the world, please feel free to check the IIAS website. For the people who have registered, there will be a recording of the lecture made and something put up in the near future. So please keep an eye out for that. So, yes, thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.